Hello, and welcome to OUTLORE Podcast. I'm Eleanor Neale, and in today's episode, we're in London in 2007, where a 29-year-old man wearing nothing but his underwear ran out into the street, bleeding and screaming. That morning, he had been chained up and held hostage in a nearby apartment, and now that he had very bravely escaped, he could tell everyone exactly who had done this to him. It was one of the most famous celebrities in Britain at the time, a 46-year-old pop star named Boy George. Outlaw. There's currently a film in the works all about the life of Boy George, who is probably one of the most famous pop boys to ever come out of Britain. Not only did he have a solo career as Boy George, but he was also the lead singer of a band called Culture Club, who did Karma Chameleon. I'm not going to sing it for you, but I already know it's going to be stuck in your head after you've watched this episode. Or if you're a reality fan, maybe you saw him on The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. He's also done other shows like The Voice. He was on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here a couple of years ago. These are quite recent things in Boy George's career timeline though. He originally rose to fame in the 80s, and he was massive in the 80s as part of the new romantic wave. He was known for wearing makeup, not conforming to gendered clothing, and it wasn't just in Britain here where he was massive. He was Mr. Worldwide before there was a Mr. Worldwide in the form of Pitbull. Boy George was selling out tours across continents. And at the height of his fame in 1985, 24-year-old George Allen O'Dowd, which is his full name, came out as bisexual. Me too! This was a huge deal at the time, especially because it was during the AIDS crisis, where homophobia and the demonization of the LGBTQ+ community was at a peak. And then about 10 years after he came out as bisexual, he was then around 34 years old, he came out as completely gay, and I believe he still labels himself as such to this day. Over the years though, behind this immense fame, George's personal life had taken a really dark spiral, and in 2007, he was found guilty of doing something horrific. And I have to tell you this story before it's too late, because Boy George, like I said in the beginning, is actually producing his own biopic movie about himself as we speak, and people are wondering if he is going to try and rewrite history and depict this event that we're going to talk about today in a much more favourable light. So today, we're telling this story for his victim, Audun Carlsen. Before we get any further, I want to warn you that we're going to be covering a lot of sensitive subjects today, including violence, drug abuse, and torture. So, as always, viewer discretion is advised. I'd also like to thank NordVPN for sponsoring this episode of Outlaw on YouTube. I like to think of NordVPN as my internet bodyguard. Not only does she help me access other countries' news and media, but she also blocks any dodgy websites and phishing scams, which, let me tell you, are a real issue, especially when we're writing these cases. I'll be down a research rabbit hole when I've clicked on what looks like a news article, but then suddenly all these ads are flashing across my screen trying to sell me clothes and skincare. I'm trying to click out of them, but I keep getting redirected to scammer websites until it all just like shuts my browser down. And it's on these dodgy links and ads and product listings that your details can be compromised. And the risk isn't only to your bank details and your money, but with your identity information as well. But NordVPN's Threat Protection Pro puts a stop to all of that. It spots dodgy websites and detects at least 85% of all phishing websites. It even catches the scam sites in action and gives you a heads up before you hand over your hard-earned money for that outfit that's just caught your eye. All you need to do is switch on your device and Threat Protection Pro does the rest. No more scams, no more stress. You can browse and shop in peace. And obviously, I got you a little gift, a little offer. Get an exclusive NordVPN deal and 4 months extra when you click the link down below in the description. That's nordvpn.com/Eleanor. It's risk-free with NordVPN's 30-day money-back guarantee. And that 30-day money-back guarantee effectively gives you a 30-day free trial. So I think it's a no-brainer. I never use the internet without NordVPN. So once again, thank you to them for sponsoring this episode of Outlaw Podcast on YouTube. Now, back to this Boy George case. I guess we should start from the very beginning. George Allen O'Dowd, aka Boy George, was born on the 14th of June 1961 in Kent, England. He was raised in southeast London in a huge Irish family. He was one of 6 kids, but his home environment was very turbulent and honestly, just plain sad. His father had a violent temper that would often be taken out on his wife, on George's mother, and all of the kids would lay witness to the abuse of their mum. To distance himself from this, I guess, George, aged around 11, would take himself out for long walks just to get out of the house. He managed to find out, actually, where David Bowie's house was, and he would go and walk by it and look at it often because he was so inspired by Bowie. He would just, gaze up at the house in awe of potentially being in the presence of such a musical inspiration. As the O'Dowd siblings all reached their teenage years, George really stood out, especially among his brothers. They were all into cars and football and girls, whereas George loved jewellery and dressing up and David Bowie. George was so inspired by Bowie, in fact, that he was desperate to give music a go himself. And so in 1981, at the age of 20, George formed his super successful band, Culture Club, and my God, did they hit the ground running. The very next year, they had a huge hit with their song, Do You Really Want to Hurt Me? Still one of their most famous songs to this day. And this smash hit propelled them into the charts, gave them international fame. Of course, this is a time of zero social media as well, so to be reaching audiences all the way over in Asia and Africa just tells you how huge they were. Their music was catchy, and their lead singer, Boy George, was an intriguing character. He had a very androgynous look. He would wear makeup, he'd wear skirts paired with top hats, and more recently, a full-on beard. So he was mixing all these different elements of clothing and expression that people had never really seen before. In the early 1980s, Boy George was one of the first globally famous non-binary looking people out there. Audiences were taken aback by such a unique expression of gender. It was the 80s and homophobia was rampant, so you can imagine that some people were very hateful, but not everyone. Boy George simply existing in this way opened the minds of so many people that hadn't come across anyone like him before, and a lot of people loved it. He became an icon for youngsters that were questioning their own gender identity and experimenting with expression or their sexuality. Having a famous, openly and unapologetically queer representative was massive for the LGBTQ+ community in the 80s. Boy George was very brave, and the gays loved him for it. As we mentioned briefly earlier, this was a time when the community needed this positivity and bravery more than ever. During the AIDS epidemic, not only were so many members of the community literally falling sick and dying, but surviving members were being hate crimed and socially ostracized to terrifying extents. Since AIDS was very misunderstood, it was thought to be a gay man's disease, and it took so long for this belief to be dismantled. Despite the fact that babies were being born with AIDS and other groups were also being disproportionately affected, it was still being scapegoated as a gay disease. So what was the UK government's response to the epidemic here? Well, they created a law making it illegal for authorities to support anything that promoted being gay. But if anyone was going to be an ally and a changemaker, leave it to the People's Princess, our Di. In April 1987, famously, Princess Diana of Wales opened the first hospital ward in Britain dedicated to people with AIDS and HIV. In front of the press, she held the hand of a man who had HIV, and this was huge. Another misunderstanding when it came to AIDS in the 80s was that you could catch it from simply touching someone, shaking hands with someone who was affected. People were too scared to go near AIDS patients until Princess Diana publicly proved that that wasn't the case. For years after this, Diana made it her mission to take away the homophobic, fear-mongering stigma that had been wrongly put onto people with AIDS, as well as fighting for a cure. And finally, though far too late, by the end of the 1980s, the world started reacting. After the gay community and allies fought so incredibly hard while watching their friends suffer and die, medical intervention, research, and proper treatment finally started to happen. Obviously, I can't cover the entire AIDS epidemic in this video, so I do really recommend going away and doing your own research. This is just a brief rundown, just to give you the context that's required to set the scene of this horrific crime that we're discussing today. Speaking of, back to Boy George, a figurehead of the LGBTQ+ community at this point in time. But as beloved as he was, his reputation would soon be thrown into question. Over the years, he had battled a serious heroin addiction, and I believe some other drugs as well. He did get sober, but then in the early 2000s, he relapsed again, which is what leads us to the events of today's true crime story, when George, aged 46, got in contact with a 29-year-old Norwegian male model named Audun Carlsen. One day in January 2007, George was scrolling on Gaydar, which is like mostly a dating/hookup app, but people do just go there to make friends and connections too. George came across a rather handsome-looking young man on Gaydar named Audun Carlsen. He was 29 years old, and George made the first move. He messaged Audun asking if he would be interested in doing some nude modelling, and Boy George himself would be the photographer. Audun was interested, and the men chatted away until they came to an agreement. Audun would do this nude modelling job for £400. It was a deal. George possibly sounds a little bit sleazy right now, but this wasn't entirely random from him. I've only really told you about his pop star endeavours so far, but he was a man of many talents, of many creative outlets. He tried his hand at fashion design, DJing, he's quite well known for his DJing, and now he was dabbling in photography. So it makes sense for him to be seeking out a model, but doing it through Gaydar is a bit wild. Like, where's the professionalism? Where's the HR team? And the photo shoot would take place at George's own house, at his flat in Shoreditch, which, again, red flag, right? A one-on-one nude photo shoot at the photographer's private home without anyone else there. But when Audun turned up at George's flat a few weeks later for the job, it seemed totally fine, actually. He took off his clothes, nothing weird. He posed. George took pictures, but then things took a turn. Audun claims that George just starts railing lines of cocaine, getting off his face. But the photo shoot continues anyway. Later, Audun said that he was sat naked in a chair being photographed when George dropped the camera, approached him, and started to perform oral sex on him. This lasted only around 5 seconds before Audun rejected him and said, no, that's not what I'm here for. Audun was being paid to do a nude photo shoot. This wasn't an escort job. This wasn't a hookup. He wasn't even sexually attracted to George. That's something he's said himself, and he insists that he made that clear. Audun was in professional mode that day. This was a job to him. But I guess for George, this was some sort of like fantasy porn scenario, that it was like written between the lines that photo shoot actually meant like a hookup as well. But that's not what Audun wanted, and so after being rejected, Audun said that George seemed a bit upset, but like he acted like it was no big deal. They carried on the shoot just fine, and it was afterwards that George started getting all weird again. He was like tense and paranoid, and as Audun was getting ready to leave, George began accusing him of hacking into his laptop while George wasn't in the room, and he was saying that Audun had stolen the naked photos that had just been taken, as well as like some other shit, like personal details, personal pictures. And Boy George was so serious about this, and Audun denied all these accusations. He was very confused where this had come from, but he was trying his best to defuse the situation. And it worked for the most part. But George then refused to pay Audun the full fee of £400 that was prior agreed. Audun didn't want to provoke George at this point in time. After all, he was very coked up, he was very paranoid, he was very aggressive. And so Audun settled for less money, £300, and he left without issue. George was appeased. Audun gets to go home away from this erratic man. But over the coming weeks, Boy George was bombarding Audun with threatening emails, still accusing him of hacking into the computer during the session. But it's like George couldn't decide whether he wanted to fight Audun or flirt with him. He would suddenly apologise and then lay it on thick, saying that he wanted to spank Audun, saying that he had a gem of an arse. What a way with words you have, Boy George. He eventually asked if Audun would be interested in doing another paid photo shoot, and he said yes. So a second meetup was booked in. Now, I know people are going to be like, well, why on earth did Audun go back? And the short answer is, I don't know. Maybe he needed the money. Maybe he wanted to connect and repair the relationship with Boy George, who was one of the most powerful figures in music and in the gay scene. Maybe Audun felt confident that he would be able to navigate any situations that arise, like the last one. Just stay well away from the guy's laptop and everything should be fine, right? But no, Audun would come to deeply regret giving Boy George another chance. 3 months after their first meetup, it was April 28th, 2007, Audun returned to George's flat, confident that things were smoothed over. Little did he know, George had been festering over this incident the whole entire time. In fact, George had an ulterior motive for booking in this second photo shoot. He still believed that Audun had hacked into the laptop, and he wanted him to admit it. So, the photo shoot starts off the same as last time. It was quite professional until, once again, George starts racking up lines of coke. I'm unsure if Audun joined in, but we know for sure that George was off his face. And then, mid-shoot, George told Audun that he needed to pop to the shops to get some milk. Interesting time for a grocery restock, but hey-ho. George left the room, and then Audun overheard him talking to someone in the hallway. He thought it must have been a neighbour, because as far as Audun was aware, they were the only two in the apartment. But it wasn't. George had actually asked a friend to come round that day as backup for when he ultimately confronted Audun. The plan was to take control of Audun's phone and his laptop and check them for the potentially stolen images from last time. But I guess George felt as though he needed some muscle to make sure that Audun didn't try and stop him or fight back. So this choice to bring in physical backup, some muscle, is proof that George anticipated that the confrontation with Audun would get physical. There would be a tussle at the very least, but what actually ensued was much worse. George led this friend to the bedroom and told him to wait there, and then he called Audun in. Of course, when Audun walks in, he wasn't expecting to see another man in there. He was naked as hell. He was shocked. But he barely had any time to react, because as soon as he was through the door, George and his new sidekick jumped him. They tackled him, they dragged him to the bed, and the whole time George was allegedly hitting and kicking him, yelling fucking whore. The friendly facade was gone, and the anger that had been burning inside him for months was unleashed. The next thing Audun knew, he was being held down on the bed while George whipped out some handcuffs. He grabbed Audun's wrist and chained him to a wall fixture above the bed. I mean, I can't even imagine how terrified Audun would have felt in that moment. Not only is he being attacked, but the guy doing this to him is rich, famous, powerful, and clearly totally off his fucking rocker. He is high as hell. He's been on so many drugs, and he is convinced of Audun's guilt. And there was no persuading him otherwise. And how can Audun protect himself now that he's been shackled up by this madman? He had no idea of what George's plan was or what George was even capable of. The first thing that George did, now that he had Audun trapped, was leave the room. Yeah, he just left Audun locked up, terrified. George's muscle sidekick friend also left the apartment completely at this point. I guess his job was done now that Audun was secured. And then, when George re-enters the room, well, different reports actually say different things about this. Some say that he was frantically flitting in and out of the room the whole time. Others say that he only left once and then came back. I'd assume that the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle of that. But one thing that we do know for sure is that George took Audun's phone and his laptop with him when he left the room. He was going to search his property to make sure that Audun hadn't stolen any photographs or information. As far as we can tell, George didn't actually find anything on Audun's electricals. No stolen materials, nothing. Audun was innocent. But despite this discovery, George still wasn't happy. When he rushed back into the bedroom, he yelled to his chained up victim, "Now you're gonna get what you deserve." And he began physically attacking him. And this time, George allegedly had weapons. He'd brought a box of leather straps, some chains, some sex toys, and he was using all of it to hit Audun, but just to make it clear, no sexual assault actually took place. This whole ordeal lasted around 30 minutes until Audun managed to break free from the fixture that he had been cuffed to. He'd been yanking on it the whole time trying to get free, and eventually I think it just flew off the whole entire wall. We read a report that said he'd managed to unscrew it, but I actually think that seems unlikely. I think it's more just the brute force of yanking at it. And with this handcuff still attached, Audun fled the bedroom and ran to the front door. George was chasing after him, beating him with a chain this whole time as Audun's struggling to get the front door unlocked and open. George wasn't even really trying to restrain him or keep him in the apartment, really. It seems that he was just trying to get in a few more whacks with the chain before his victim escaped. Eventually, Audun got the door open and fled out into the street, wearing only his underwear and his trainers. He was bleeding from his various injuries, and George didn't chase him outside. He just stayed in his apartment and let Audun run away. Luckily, the injuries that Audun had sustained were only skin-deep cuts and scrapes and marks and bruises. He wouldn't need hospital treatment, but still, he was a mostly naked man running through the streets with blood on him, on his arms and on his head. It would have been a shock for any passerby to witness. A man working in a nearby shop came to help and rang the police. I believe he also took Audun into his shop for safety in case George did change his mind and came back looking for him. Police took Audun back to the station so that he could tell them about his whole ordeal. And remember, he still had the handcuff attached to one wrist and they were really struggling to get it off him. Well, back at the police station, they actually had to saw it off his arm. I struggle to say the word saw in my accent because it sounds like a saw, but saw. So Audun tells the police everything from the very beginning, that he met his attacker on gaydar. Chances are he was already familiar with Boy George since he was a celebrity, especially in the gay scene. Something important to know, actually, going forward, is that Audun is HIV positive, and he said that he had told George this beforehand. But when George was arrested and questioned by the police, he would use Audun's HIV against him. Of course, Audun had told the police that George performed oral sex on him that first time that they met, but George denied that detail, telling the police, "I'd never have slept with someone who is HIV positive." So by George denying that one detail happening, he's trying to paint a picture of Audun as a complete liar who has fabricated this whole story to the police, not just the sex, but the attack too. It's absolutely devastating for Boy George, a gay man, a gay celebrity, a figurehead of the LGBTQ+ community who rose to fame during the AIDS crisis, to use someone's status as HIV positive against them. So I do actually just want to pause here and quickly talk about today's charity. Keeping in the theme of gay pop stars from the 80s, I actually want to talk about Elton John's AIDS Foundation. Now, I know it's already a very well-known charity, but that's for good reason, because the work that they do is so important. The Elton John AIDS Foundation is an AIDS and HIV charity that supports people worldwide to get access to treatment and resources, while also funding critical research into AIDS and HIV. And right now, this charity is more important than ever because recently, I don't know if it's going to change today, while I'm filming this, but the US government has cut critical funding and grants for HIV and AIDS. And it's not only Americans who are going to be suffering from these cuts. Other countries, many of them in Africa, like Nigeria and Kenya, could soon run out of HIV drugs following America's decision to stop funding the United Nations program for HIV and AIDS, which is why the Elton John AIDS Foundation in particular is so crucial, because they're desperately trying to pick up the slack and help prevent the devastation that this has and will cause not only in America but globally. Of course, the link to the foundation will be down in the description of this episode. Please do consider donating this Pride Month. The LGBTQ+ community is disproportionately affected by HIV and AIDS. It's a fact that gay men are 35 times more likely to get HIV, while trans women are 14 times more likely. Those statistics need to drop, because if those odds were stacked against heterosexuals, I'm sure the governments would have worked much harder to lower those numbers a hell of a lot more by now. So, anyway, back to Boy George, who was pretty much immediately arrested and brought into custody. He denied a lot of what Audun was alleging against him. He insisted that he'd never had sex with him. He insisted that he never beat him with chains. He essentially denied all of the violent stuff. The only thing that he admitted to was that he had restrained Audun because he wanted to search his devices to see if he had in fact hacked into his laptop the last time that they'd seen each other. Also, he definitely couldn't deny the handcuffing because it was still on his fucking wrist when he got to the police station. They had to sew it off him. George told the police he struggled a bit when I was handcuffing him because he realised I wasn't messing around. I didn't tell him the reason I was doing what I was doing. I said I just wanted to check something. He said, let me go. If I was going to beat him up, I would have got my friend to beat him up with me, if I was going to do anything that vile. He said that Audun was so smug and he was lying, saying it wasn't me, that it wasn't him that stole the photos. The police were not buying it. And so George was charged with false imprisonment, and this case went to court in December 2008, over a year and a half after the incident took place. In court, the jury was shown pictures of the red welts on Audun's head and his arms, the wounds that he said George had inflicted by beating him with chains. I'm sure you can already guess that George denied this, but when he was asked, well, what else could have caused these big red welts, if not his violence? And he actually, once again, used Audun's HIV against him. For context, people with HIV and AIDS can sometimes develop these rashes and welts, like red bumps that can scab over, and these usually appear during the very early phases. These marks can also be caused by reactions to medication and complications, which again, as far as we know, Audun wasn't experiencing that either. I also think it's relatively obvious the difference between the rashy welts that could be caused by HIV that would look like patches of red inflamed skin all over his body. We know what rashes look like, but that's not what the pictures showed. Audun's wounds were clearly welts and cuts and broken skin from being beaten with a weapon, with chains. Another one of George's excuses for the wounds was that they could have been sustained from the bondage gear that they'd used during the nude photo shoot. And at this point, it's like, well, which one is it? Are you blaming the HIV or are you blaming the bondage gear? I'm also thinking, if it was the HIV, then surely Audun would have already had the marks and the welts in the photo shoot pictures, so they can just look at that, right? Honestly, in my personal opinion, I think Boy George's defense here is a shambles. It's a load of shit. Like, pick a side, you know what I mean? Pick a theory. Also, I do need to add in a little side note because Boy George went on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here a couple of years ago, and he was chatting about this incident, literally, on national television, and he is still, to this day, making out like Audun lied. He publicly said that there weren't any photos of Audun's injuries, which is confusing because jurors literally saw them during the trial. They were used as evidence. So how is Boy George lying on primetime national TV, in my opinion? I don't know if I can get sued for anything in this video. There's going to be a lot of allegedlys, but the jury saw them. What do you mean? And you know what? All this kind of stuff is what makes me especially worried about the biopic in the works, because it's very clear now that even almost 2 decades later, Boy George is still trying to paint his victim as a liar. He is refusing to give closure to the victim that he had falsely imprisoned and beat up. But back to the trial. When Audun was asked why he thinks that George attacked him, he told them, I think he couldn't handle the refusal of me not having sex with him. In fact, Audun even said in his trial, he's not a person I would find attractive to have sex with. But whether it was down to genuine drug-fueled paranoia that Audun had stolen the photos and hacked his computer, or whether it was merely embarrassed rage from being rejected and turned down, one thing was very clear. Boy George was guilty, and the jury thought so too. He was found guilty of false imprisonment and assault, and for that he was sentenced to 15 months in prison, with the judge calling the crime callous and humiliating. George was initially sent to Pentonville Prison in London, which is known to be a tough prison, but it certainly wasn't a good environment for an openly gay man to exist in, I will say that. George claimed that he had become a target for other inmates and he was beaten up in a homophobic attack. We haven't actually been able to verify that this happened, but I'm not going to sit here and say that it's not true. I just find it interesting, actually, because in recent years, he has said in interviews and on TV and stuff that he actually had a great time in prison and all the other prisoners loved him. So I'm not entirely sure. Maybe he is referring to the second prison that he got transferred to, because obviously they realised that the first one wasn't a good fit for him. So he was transferred to Suffolk. And that does seem like a much nicer experience. In fact, I would call it like the Prison Pro experience. Like, it's a much smaller environment with a lot less inmates. It's out in the countryside in rural England. Like, it's so not the same. It's like the premium prison experience. It's kind of bougie. A lot of rich people get sent to this prison in Suffolk. There's a lot more space. It's a lot more chill. It's a much more pleasant experience. And George would only have to spend 4 months there before he was released for good behaviour. He was allowed to leave on the condition that he wore an ankle monitor and abided by a strict curfew. And this is fairly common in the UK. A lot of prisoners with short sentences can be released after only serving like 40 to 50% of their time. So that was it for George. He was out and back to being a pop star DJ extraordinaire. Over the years, George has been asked in TV appearances and interviews about this incident, and you can imagine how it goes every time. He never talks about it for very long. He always continues the conversation and like redirects, but every single time he denies the violent side of the crime. Despite the guilty verdict, though, is what gets me. Like, you have literally been found guilty in a court of law. George has, however, apologised to Audun for what went on that day. He blames the paranoia and the aggression on his drug addiction at the time, saying that it was basically a psychotic drug-fueled rampage. Since being released, we also couldn't find anything of George publicly addressing the way that he spoke about Audun's HIV either. I would have hoped for an apology on that too, really, given that he is supposed to be a figurehead of the LGBTQ+ community, but whatever. Audun says that even still to this day, this incident has completely ruined his life. He has been left with constant back issues from the attack, and he's too traumatized to trust people in intimate relationships now. Not to mention the psychological hurt that he has endured seeing his attacker on TV, appearing in reality shows like I'm a Celebrity and The Voice, denying the violent reality of the situation that Audun was subjected to. George's career carried on practically unchanged, while Audun still suffers physically and mentally every single day. Boy George was asked about how the crime would be portrayed in his upcoming movie, to which he said, "I'm no longer going to say I did something that I didn't do. I want my truth in the movie. The only thing I care about right now in terms of this movie is how they portray that." I am honestly worried about Audun's mental health when that movie comes out. It's frankly devastating that a crime that traumatized him and left him with lasting pain will be rewritten by the perpetrator himself for the big screen. Hundreds of thousands of people will likely see and believe the narrative told in the biopic without seeking out any further details. And that's another reason I wanted this episode out there for when people get home from the movie theatre and they Google it. I want Audun Carlsen's side of the story to be loud and clear. I'm not sure if we'll reach as many people as the movie with just this episode of Outlaw Podcast. But now that you guys have heard the victim's side of the story, we can keep spreading that together and supporting him through the aftermath of such an awful case. But that is all we have for today. Again, a huge thank you to NordVPN for collabing with us to make this episode possible. Remember, you can get an exclusive NordVPN deal and 4 months extra when you click the link down below in the description. That's nordvpn.com/Eleanor. It's risk-free with NordVPN's 30-day money-back guarantee. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Outlaw Podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a like, leave a comment so that we can continue the conversation. If you're listening on a podcast platform, Rate us 5 stars. Go on. And I will see you in the next episode. Bye.